You're watching theAnalysis-news, and I'm Talia Baroncelli. This is part 2 of my conversation with human rights lawyer and anthropologist Petra Molnar. We've been discussing her recent book, The Walls Have Eyes, and in this episode, we'll get into the geopolitical implications of border and surveillance technology. If you've been enjoying these episodes, feel free to go to our website, theanalysis.news, and support us by hitting the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Make sure you're on our mailing list. That way you're always up to date every time we send out new content and that it gets sent straight to your inbox. You can also like and subscribe to the show on podcast streaming services such as Spotify or Apple, or on our YouTube channel. See you in a bit with Petra Molnar. Joining me now is Petra Molnar. She's a human rights lawyer and anthropologist who co-runs the Refugee Law Lab at York University in Toronto. And she also co-founded the Migration and Technology Monitor, which does work on human rights and technology. She's the author of a new book called The Walls Have Eyes: Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. So thanks so much for joining me today, Petra.
Thanks so much for having me.
I think one thing that became evident to me reading your book is that the legal framework to deal with AI is, it's a patchwork. It's not coherent across the globe. And in the United States, when you deal with, or in Canada, for example, when you deal with a lot of these high risk technologies, it's a completely different legal landscape. And you were also involved in critiquing the European Union's AI Act. So I was wondering if you could shed some light on that, because I think the AI Act's provisions when it comes to high risk systems is, probably not enough to ensure that this erosion of rights doesn't bleed over into other areas.
Yeah. So, for those who are familiar with my work, you know that I'm a reluctant lawyer, but I'm still a lawyer. So I'll put on my lawyer hat for a second. It's an interesting time now to try and understand the kind of governance mechanisms and lawmaking that's happening on technology generally and border tech specifically. I think it's fair to say that, we don't have a lot of law, globally speaking and domestically speaking, to regulate really high risk technology. And again, that's not an accident, right? Because it allows powerful actors to experiment, to innovate, to move fast and break things, right? That was a common slogan in Silicon Valley. And just introduce more and more technology without any kind of guardrails. Now, you mentioned the European Union's AI Act. This was a really interesting opportunity to create a framework for governance of artificial intelligence. And that's hard to do, right? Like, to be totally fair, we're talking about an omnibus piece of lawmaking, this massive bill that tries to deal with all sorts of facets of AI, from toys to, transport to border tech. And that's hard to do, right? It took many, many years. And there was a coalition of us, academics, lawyers, civil society, that tried to get the members of the European Parliament to think about what this tech is actually doing to real people, in our case, at the border. And we were actually calling for some bans of some of the most high-risk uses of technology, whether that's, for example, individualized risk assessments that use artificial intelligence, or the use of predictive analytics for border decision-making and border interdictions, which are actually illegal under international law, and a few other of these amendments. But unfortunately, but perhaps not surprisingly, none of these amendments made it in, again, because migration is an incredibly politicized issue. And so it's interesting because when you actually go into the text of the act, at first blush, you're like, what is she talking about? There is a high risk kind of matrix in there that is used to determine what technologies are considered high risk and what some of the protections need to be had, right, when we're talking about these projects. Except when you actually look closely, you will see that there are a lot of exceptions or derogations into the act under national security. So if a member state is able to say, well, but we need this project for national security, none of those high-risk measures apply. And surprise, surprise, border tech and national security are often conflated together. And the last thing I'll say about the AI Act is, again, it's a missed opportunity, right? Because it really could have set a global precedent on regulating AI, especially border tech. And because it didn't do that, what incentive does the United States have to regulate, or Canada, or Australia? I'm not saying that the European Union should have all this power, right, to designate necessarily what we regulate, but it just sets a global conversation in motion that now again reaffirms that we don't have a lot of guardrails or even a lot of conversations about a moratorium or a ban of some of the highest risk technologies. And I don't really know where this is going to go, to be honest, because, the optimist in me says, well, the more people learn about it, the more conversations we're going to have. But maybe the realist pessimist says, I mean, we can't even agree on autonomous weapons used in war, right? And how to regulate those. What are the chances that we're going to agree on some sort of, global agreement on border technologies? It's not very likely. I think it's definitely going to continue being this laboratory of experimentation because it's also a very lucrative one. And again, kind of back to what we were saying before, because the private sector increasingly has the ear of governments, whether through lobbying in Brussels or, I mean, now like literally in the Oval Office with Musk, it's not really likely that we're going to see more regulation in the tech space at all.
Right, and this also goes to a lot of the Israeli tech firms that are involved in developing surveillance and other technologies that can be used at the border, like Elbit Systems, for example, an Israeli company, which, I mean, they develop drone technology and other technologies which are used even by Frontex, for example, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency in the European Union. Frontex uses drones made by Elbit System to surveil the Mediterranean and other parts of the EU borders. And so and of course, a lot of the weapons that Albert makes is also used in the US context. So, I mean, how does this all line up? Because there are various issues that are involved here. It is obviously a politicized issue, and using technologies made by an Israeli firm, which most probably have been first developed on Palestinians in the occupied territories. I mean, how does this sort of ensure that there is a global hierarchy in place?
Yeah, and a global hierarchy that firmly places Israeli technology at the top, right? This is something that, people like Anthony Lewinstein, who's a Jewish journalist, have been writing on for a long time. He published a book called The Palestine Laboratory, specifically on the Israel testing of technologies on Palestinians and then exporting it out for other uses. And I've been doing research on this too from the border perspective, right? Like you mentioned, there's Heron drones and Elbit drones that are flown around the Mediterranean and the GNC. There's Elbit Systems surveillance towers in the Sonora Desert. That's an Israeli company, right? And so much of this technology is first tested out in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank. I was in the West Bank in the spring of 2023 in places like Hebron and Ramallah and other places as well, where a lot of this technology takes place. And, seeing it firsthand, like you really realize the power of normalizing this omnipresent surveillance that's first tested out on Palestinians and then exported out to the border. And geopolitically, too, I mean, we are seeing so much problematic decision making around the normalization of tech because so many Western actors are afraid to take a stand, right, on what is happening and what Israel is doing with the genocide in Gaza, also testing autonomous weapons on Palestinians there, right? Like it is this kind of normalization of so much of this tech that unfortunately has its tendrils in so many other applications. It doesn't just stay in Gaza or the occupied West Bank, but then it actually filters out into other spaces too.
I wanted to ask you about the ways in which a lot of these securitized approaches to migration and to what they call migration management is actually used as an extension of foreign policy. And so you write about this in your book, and Todd Miller, who I know is a colleague and friend of yours, who wrote the book Emperor of Borders, he's also written about this in terms of how the U.S. Custom and Border Protection officers are stationed around the globe to actually prevent migration to the United States. So, in a sense, they're functioning as a tool of U.S. imperialism beyond the actual territory and jurisdiction of the United States. And we see this in the European Union context, in which the European Coast Guard and Border Agency Frontex is stationed along the periphery of the European Union, and in certain instances in Poland, for example, which you wrote about, they're actually screening people and ensuring that only Ukrainians are allowed in and allowed the right to asylum, and they can move to whichever country they want within the European Union to get protection. Whereas certain people, such as Afghans or Syrians who are also escaping conflict, are not afforded the same right, even though the right to asylum is actually for everyone. But there's been a derogation away from those laws in favor of, in this case, Ukrainians over other people. So could you speak about the way that these policies are used as an extension of imperialism in foreign policy?
Yeah, and this goes back to those kind of logics that we were talking about, right? That underpin who is welcome, who is seen as a quote unquote worthy refugee, and which populations are again rendered as threats, frauds, and terrorists. And so much of this breaks down along racial lines, right? And the kind of projects of empire and white supremacy that Todd Miller writes about, and also Harsha Walia and my colleague Tendaya Chiume. I mean, these kind of racial logics that need to be paid attention to in terms of how we even conceptualize a person on the move that is welcome versus someone who is not. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Polish Belarusian border situation because I think this really brought it to light in many ways. So a few years ago, the Belarusian Lukashenko regime was essentially weaponizing migration as a way to get a bunch of sanctions lifted, sanctions that were imposed by the European Union. And he essentially invited groups of asylum seekers to come to the Belarusian Polish border and then make their way into the European Union through this forested corridor between Belarus and Poland. Of course, Poland then erected a no-go zone, militarized the border, used a lot of surveillance there that they learned about from Greece, interestingly enough, and essentially trapped hundreds of people in a freezing forest. It was this kind of weaponization of migration and on part of the Lukashenko regime, but also on part of Poland to say, like, these refugees are not welcome, right? A lot of them came from Iraqi Kurdistan, Syria, Afghanistan. Then, a few months later, when the full-scale occupation of Ukraine began, right, we saw a very different response, an essential open border policy, kilometers down, right, at the Polish-Ukrainian border, where I was there with colleagues doing human rights monitoring. And having seen this massive shift from a few months ago at the Polish-Belarusian border, where it was securitized, militarized, unwelcome, babies were dying in freezing forests. And then on the other hand, Ukrainian refugees were allowed to come into the European Union with open arms, essentially. It again brought these logics of race exclusion into sharp focus. And I'm not saying that Ukrainian refugees should not have been welcome. I think that was wonderful, right? It just shows that it is all about these logics and constructions of who is welcome and who isn't, right? And it could have been a moment of hope as well, right? Because it's like if it's possible to do this for Ukrainian refugees, then it is possible to do it for other refugees too, right? Although even with Ukrainian refugees, right, the kind of tide has turned and even a few months after people were coming into European Union, there was already rumblings like, well, when are they going to go back? Like the even the humanitarian kind of space that opened up. Perhaps similarly to what happened in 2015, 2016 when Syrian refugees were entering European Union for the first time. Unfortunately, yeah, I mean, I think that space has shrunk and unfortunately, migration has kind of been weaponized again, even against Ukrainian refugees now.
There's a part of your book, I think it was a chapter that's called "We Are Here Because You Were There." Can you explain that? As I think, I mean, it just it's really powerful, but it's very short, and I think it represents a lot more in terms of history and migration. So I was hoping that you could explain that to people.
Sure. And I can't take credit for this statement. This is something that has been said a lot by people in the global majority and people who are on the move themselves as a way to recognize that so much of human movement and migration is as a result, again, of Western imperialism, of conflict, of colonialization. And the reason why people are moving is again because of Western action, right? And there is this kind of amnesia, I think, on part of the European Union and the United States, this almost like shock. Like, why are people coming, right? Well, it's because of wars that have been perpetrated by the West for centuries, decades, right? And so I like this reframing because it also, I think, reintroduces agency and dignity and choice on part of mobile populations that are making their way westward, perhaps, right? And it also has perhaps a reminder of the kind of conversations that are being had about reparations. Like does the West owe communities that have been disenfranchised historically, bombed out, at the receiving end of environmental degradation too, largely as a result of Western inaction, right, on the global climate crisis as well. That also forces people to move. I think it's a great reminder of the responsibility of powerful actors, to at least try and understand why people are coming. What are some of the root causes of migration? And the root cause conversation is something that is just not being had, right? Like we are focusing on drones at the border, stronger border, migration management, more technology, keeping people away, rather than actually addressing the root causes of why people have to move. And if I can just share, an anecdote, I mean, this is something I think that is so simple, but a lot of people don't think about. I have heard this time and again from people who are on the move, but people don't want to be refugees, right? That is not a choice that you would make willy nilly or like, oh, I'm just going to do this now, right? And that's not saying that people don't have economic reasons to migrate as well. I think that's actually perfectly fine to have legitimate needs of asylum and also have economic reasons to move. We are all complex beings. But I think it's a reminder that, again, people don't want to be forced from their home. If they could stay home, a lot of people would, right? But again, it goes back to the root causes of why people are having to move and, why they are finding themselves in places that, again, are the places that are perhaps the reason why they had to move in the first place.
Well, could you speak about that a bit more? Because I think some people look at migration through a very narrow lens, maybe through a security lens or even just through a strictly asylum lens. And they don't actually look at some of the broader hierarchies and forces that are involved. I mean, how, like, based on the research that you've done in various parts of the globe, how would you say that migration is actually a product of a lot of global hierarchies, but also strategies of capitalist accumulation and, poverty and marginalization?
Yeah, and this is where the work of Harsha Walia comes to mind and the great reporting that the Transnational Institute has been doing on this for years and years, tying, for example, Western warmongering in spaces like sub-Saharan Africa to the kind of creation of forced migration and profiting off of this. Literally war profiteering, right? And then it rubs up against these anxieties about keeping the border safe, preventing people from coming into the European Union. This is also where we see a lot of, the big word for it is externalization. But really all that means is European Union and, the United States pushing its border further afield and using different types of tools, whether that is surveillance or training of border guards or just basically any kind of mechanism to prevent people from even reaching European territory. The border actually moves into North Africa or sub-Saharan Africa as a result. So there's kind of this tension there, right? Because we see these largely Western forces creating a lot of the conflict or stoking a lot of the conflict, or at the very least being willfully blind to things like environmental degradation, and then strengthening the border regime, the exclusion, the externalization through tech, through policymaking, through deterrence, right? And yet just being so unprepared, I think, for the fact that more and more people are going to be migrating in the coming decades. That I think is a given. And I'm not saying that again as a like the fear monger, but I think that's a fact of life now. And it's important to pay attention to again how capital and, like you say, resource accumulation, extraction, also labor issues that come into this, right, with the development of technology, which communities get tested on when it comes to technology, that all really comes back to this kind of global story of who gets to benefit from being in the West, who gets to benefit from new technology, and which communities, again, are at the receiving end of all of this and relegated to the margins.
Do you think that with the climate crisis just getting worse, that the EU and the United States will continue to use these sort of techno-solutionist approaches to deal with people who are fleeing due to economic or climate destruction?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but that's the kind of trend that we've been noticing. Again, externalization, more technology, more surveillance. Um, Not even dealing with environmental degradation within the United States or within Europe, right? The massive flooding, the droughts, the forest fires, right, that we are seeing. I mean, that's going to stretch resources already just domestically. So imagine the kind of conversations that would need to be had about creating some sort of international protection regime for people who are going to be fleeing environmental degradation. And legally speaking, too, this is very much an open question because right now, international refugee law does not recognize environmental refugees. There have been cases, right? People have brought cases to different courts in New Zealand, for example, small island nations saying, well, we are flooding and we're going to not exist as a result of Western environmental degradation. And we should be able to apply for refugee status and meet the refugee definition because of persecution, because of environmental degradation. And it hasn't gone, right? The jurisprudence has not moved forward that way, and it maybe never will. There's, competing kind of conversations about whether that's even the appropriate way to go, amending the refugee definition, or whether there maybe needs to be a whole new legal regime for people who are migrating as a result of environmental degradation. But this is, maybe I'm biased because I work on this all the time, but I think this is the defining issue of our time, right? Because it brings together conversations around migration and the environment, and it's really going to come to a head. I mean, it already has in many ways, but we're just going to see more and more of this in the years to come.
One thing that was really interesting in your book, like a lot of the companies that you're talking about, these border and tech surveillance companies, a lot of them actually have private equity investors and, companies like Vanguard, State Street, those sorts of companies. And I'm sure BlackRock is also involved, but those private equity companies are also heavily invested in Chevron and big oil and gas that are actually contributing to a lot of the environmental destruction that we see. So in a way, it's like a sort of money laundering by contributing to the problem and then investing in the so-called solution to the problem.
Yeah, not to mention also like the labor issues around major data centers, that are oftentimes also again outside of Europe and the US. And also the environmental impacts of these massive server farms, for example. I mean, they're generating so much heat, so much electricity. And we don't like to think about that, right? Because we want the latest iPhone, we want the latest software update. Like all of this really, again, is predicated on these ways that power operates, right? And is allowed to operate in specific spaces around the world, as opposed to the other ones that are extracted from, whether it comes from, human capital, labor, mobility, all of that.
Just a final question. What do you see is, I guess, the way to approach a lot of these invasive and aggressive technologies? I mean, is it, awareness as to their effects, or is it trying to put pressure on politicians to ensure that that there's maybe more robust legislation around these different high risk systems? Or, I mean, what would you say needs to be the way forward here?
Yeah, I mean, this is the stuff that keeps me up at night. I think awareness is definitely part of it. Making sure that the public and policymakers really are aware of the effects of what this technology is already having on affected communities, right? Because this is not a theoretical conversation, but rather a real world example of violent technologies. And I think that maybe goes to my second point. And I hope this doesn't sound overly simplistic, but I think actually storytelling and story driven narratives are a way forward because we need to humanize the people who are on the receiving end of these technological experiments, So it's not just like a bunch of lawyers talking, right? But it's actually about people's experiences and expertise from the ground up that is fueling the kind of conversations that we need to be having about what we innovate on and why. And that's what the book tries to do. It's not that academic, it tries to tell people's stories and share stories that I've been, privileged to learn and to kind of steward through, and hopefully also as a way to humanize the issue a little bit so that again it's not just a bunch of data or drones or robodogs, but it's real people on the move who are on the sharpest edges of innovation.
I actually do have one final question now that you mentioned that, because there's been this rightward shift in our politics, like the overtone window has shifted, and that's partly because of the failure of the center left to actually identify, what people really need and the issues and the needs of the working class. And they've also pandered to a lot of the narratives that the right has been pushing. So, I mean, the right is always talking about migration as a problem, but would you say that one way to combat that narrative is to give another alternative, and that alternative being one that illustrates, and that's one of solidarity, that illustrates the various inequalities that are global and the ways to actually combat that, and to give something to people to hope for, and you know as opposed to seeing migrants and people on the move as someone to be scared of, or people to be fearful of, and they're taking our jobs, like all of the disinformation that's around that. What is the alternative in terms of policy to actually bring people together and point out that the enemy is not migration or migrants, but actually, the rich elite who are trying to divide us.
Yeah, and the enemy are these policies and politics of difference, right? And like pitting ourselves against each other in this system that's actually hurting all of us in different ways, but in similar ways. And absolutely, I mean, I think we need to find more togetherness. We have so much more in common with one another than we realize, right? And I think politicians have become very, very good at the kind of divide and conquer strategy. But instead, it is absolutely about creating spaces where we can learn from one another and learn from the things that affect all of us. And I think that is a way forward that hopefully will also allow for kind of creative world making that is necessary to be had in this rather difficult time for a lot of people.
Petra Molnar, it's been really illuminating speaking to you and also reading your book. I hope people read it. The Walls Have Eyes, sorry about that reflection. It's really a great book. So yeah, thanks again for joining us and hope to have you back soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you enjoyed that content, feel free to support us by going to theanalysis.news. See you next time.